Lord, if we go back to primitive societies, if you do not behave as the society approves, you may actually be sanctioned or driven out of society, in worst case scenarios, killed. Okay, so we have the superego, which is the repository of what our society believes to be the right way to behave, and it is in our head. Freud then says we have another self called the ego, ego. He used the ego not the way we use it in English language, but in his way of thinking. The ego, according to him, is kind of like a referee in our head. The referee looks at what the id wants to do, looks at what the superego can approve in the individual doing it, and makes a choice, kind of says, this is what I'm going to do. So the referee then balances the desires of the id and the repressions of the superego, and gives the individual what you might call his behavior pattern. So those three parts of the mind, he says, are not necessarily all conscious. So he argued that as we are growing up, many things that we would like to do, say the id, our parents, significant others, our society, suppresses them or tells us to suppress them. He says, but the desires are still there. So what he says is that we push them into what he came up with the name unconscious mind. To the best of my mind, Freud was perhaps the first psychologist to use the term unconscious. So he says that each of us then has an unconscious aspect to him. The unconscious aspect to him, meaning that there are things in his mind that influence behavior that he does not really consciously know about. So there is the conscious part of him, which is the part that knows what it is doing. But he believes that the conscious part is very small compared to what is in the individual's unconscious. So if you are following Freud's idea of what is the self, you look at the idea of the id, ID, and the repression of the id by society, and the fact that the id and its desires are now mostly in the unconscious. So Freud then says a modern man generally has inner conflicts. The conflicts in us are due to the struggles between the id and the world we live in, and between the conscious self and the unconscious self. There is a war going on, according to him. So generally, he says we live in conflict and kind of are confused as to what is right. So we try to behave appropriately, according to him, but sometimes those things we repressed into our unconscious minds come up and affect what we do. And we say, wow, did I do that? Yeah, he says, yes, we did that because they are part of who we are. For example, Freud argued that children have what he called polymorphous sexuality. That is to say, left to the child alone, he would have sex with everybody. He would have sex with his siblings, with his parents, particularly parents of the opposite sex, with everybody in his world. But as he grows up, he's told by society that if he does that, he'll be punished. In fact, he's punished if he ever sees his mother as a sexual object, or if he's a boy, sees the sister as a sexual object. If it is a girl, sees the father as a sexual object. Those things are repressed. Freud called them taboos, things we don't even think about at a conscious level. But he says, but they're all there in our unconscious mind. So every once in a while, those things we repressed into our unconscious mind come out in our behavior And that is why sometimes we see people do what we call irrational things, because he says there are all kinds of forces in his unconscious mind that are affecting his behavior in the here and now world. So in some people, according to Freud, these struggles lead to what he called neurosis, the neurosis. A neurotic, according to him, is basically a person who at the conscious level is a normal person, but there are many, many unconscious factors in his life that make him do irrational things. We are all a little bit neurotic, but some people are more so, according to Freud. Neurosis is not the same as mental illness, because you can be a neurotic and be a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. Whereas mental illness, currently called psychosis, is completely different. In mentally ill people, they do hallucinate in one or more of the five senses. In mentally ill people sometimes hear voices that you and I don't hear. We call it auditory hallucinations. Sometimes they see things which you and I may not see. They call it visual hallucination. They sometimes smell things, olfactory hallucination, that we don't necessarily smell. Sometimes they feel like something is crawling on their skin. We call it tactile hallucination. But at any rate, most human beings are not schizophrenic. Most human beings are not psychotic. You can divide psychosis into many types. The two major types are schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, the individual likely has hallucination and also has delusion. In delusion, you believe what is not true, what people around you do not see to be true as true. In hallucination, as mentioned, you hear voices. But only about 1% of the population are really psychotic. Either if you're psychotic, you are likely going to be schizophrenic, or you have bipolar affective disorder. If you have seen people with bipolar, they have mood swings from high to low, up top of the world where they don't make sense, and then they become depressed. But anyway, I'm kind of digressing. We're talking about the self. The self then has the conscious and the unconscious part. And the unconscious part is in our minds, but we don't know about them. So when our behaviors become frequently erratic, Freud recommended that you come to what he calls psychoanalysis. So he and his group, he formed the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. So what they did was to have the individual come to their office, lie down on a couch, and they ask you basically to don't think, don't try to use sense, reason to moderate your behavior or what you say. Just say whatever comes to your mind. For example, he will ask you a question like, what was your relationship with your mom like? He says, don't check what comes to your mind. Just say, talk about it. So the individual then will talk for about whatever comes to his mind. We call it free association. Just talk whatever enters your mind. Never mind whether what you're saying is true or not true, reasonable or not reasonable. So he says you just talk about it. The idea is that when you are doing free association, you are dredging things in your unconscious mind that are affecting your behavior out of your unconscious mind and bringing them out to the conscious. So you may bring out things like, oh, when I was 5 years, 6 years old, I used to wish to see my mom naked. Many boys will say that. Later on, many of them will say, I wish I had sex with my mom and stuff like that. Ideas which obviously in our society, nobody dares to say. Girls will say the same thing about their wish to have sexual dealings with their fathers and so on and so forth. These ideas are repressed and they affect our behavior consciously. So Freud then will have you do free association and talk to him as if you're talking to the father or the mother what you had wished to do. He calls this process transference. You're transferring things that should have gone to your father, your mom, to the psychoanalyst. And what he made you angry, you kind of feel angry at your psychoanalyst. But this is what I have for you today.